introduction, and thank you. It is an honour, on behalf of the Shire of Broome, to be part of this celebration of the upcoming 2020 season of the Sisters of St John of God Relationship Exhibition here at the Heritage Centre. I wanted to start by paying my respects to Uncle Bamba, who passed away recently, and I know that the sisters hoped he could be here today because he had such a big involvement with the centre. And I actually thought of Uncle Bamba a lot when I was reflecting on this talk this evening, because a lot of these stories I heard about the sisters, I heard directly from Uncle Bamba. He would tell me about how he was raised, he had his education with the sisters and how they instilled in him such a work ethic and such a belief that he could contribute to his world and his community however he wanted, and boy did he contribute. So I just wanted to pay my respects to Uncle Bamba tonight, and he would speak so warmly of the sisters. But in terms of my own personal experience with this place and with this, the exhibition, I actually had my first-hand experience a few years ago. I was working down at the Visitors Centre, and when I was working there, we experienced something of a phenomenon. Visitors and tourists kept returning to the centre just to tell us how much value they received from experiencing the Relationships exhibition here at the Heritage Centre. They talked about how moving it was and how much they learned. And I thought to myself, I've lived in town for 20 years now, married up here. I know that this place is very special to Uncle Bamba and to my father-in-law, Kevin Cordelano, who couldn't be here today, but he's volunteered for many years here. And yet I hadn't dropped in to check it out, so I thought I must. So I knocked off around lunchtime on Saturday at the Visitors Centre, and I walked across Mayo Oval, cut through the courthouse markets. It was on a Saturday, picked up a Saturday stick for lunch, as you do, and I continued on to the old convent here on Barker Street. And the moment I walked across the boundary onto the grounds of the old convent, I stopped in my tracks. Because after the music and the bustling colourfulness of the markets and the busyness of the Visitors Centre, this place was so suddenly peaceful and very quiet, and the air was it was almost like the air was sparkling with something. It felt really different. It was almost like it felt holy. Was it holy? I couldn't put my finger on it. It was significant. It made me stop. So I continued on into the Relationships exhibition, into the exhibition space. And once in, my eyes widened, my jaw dropped, and I looked around at the photographs, the artwork. The sounds of history were emanating from the audio studios, and the old footage was on the screens. And I was really overwhelmed, and I actually experienced something really interesting. I began to remember, and these memories came up for me, and they were memories to do with my own family and their experience with missions across the Kimberley. So my mum and dad weren't involved directly with the Sisters of St John of God, but my parents were stationed as school teachers in remote communities across the Kimberley. This is back in the 70s. And these family memories started to come up because a lot of these communities had the adjoining missions. And when I was a little girl, some of the first stories I heard my parents tell were of these experiences where the sisters' work in those communities was such an integral sort of thread in the social fabric of those places. So I started to remember the baking bread coming out of those rustic ovens, and the pungent smell of incense at the church door, rising up through the branches of the mango trees. And the sounds of hymns and organ music in the heat, mixing in with that rhythmic and sometimes quite deafening orchestra call of the jubilant frogs. You know what I'm talking about? And I was so surprised at these family memories flooding up, and it occurred to me then, if this was my experience, just from stepping into that space, I can only imagine the power and the importance of this exhibition for people whose families have had generations of direct relationship with the sisters. So I walked around the exhibition space. I went out into the courtyard and reflected in the reflection garden. And I was so mesmerised by this exhibition, and I absorbed so much, and I was learning so much. And the story I learned was and it was in such a very experiential way that I learned it. It was such a remarkable story. The Irish sisters and some Australian sisters, as the staff pointed out to me, not to forget the Australians as well, but predominantly the Irish sisters arriving here in 1907. And they were up on the peninsula, and then they came down to Broome, and you can just imagine what the place was like. The white sails of the pearl luggers would be rising out of the mangroves down there at Roebuck Bay, their decks strewn with pearl shell glinting in the sun. And in town was a wild place. You know, it was the heyday of the pearling industry. So, you know, you had people from all walks of life in this little remote town, and you had the opium dens and the noodle houses down on Sheba Lane. And, you know, it was a very, you know, and it was the dusty Pendown streets, and it was a very, you can look back at it and think about what a romantic kind of place and time it was. But of course, as romantic as it often was, there was also the nightmarish underbelly to this world. Violence and racism prevailed across the land. Discrimination was standard mode of operation for many of the authorities. And of course, there was the most devastating of government policies at play. So these were dreadful, hellish times for many, and the trauma inflicted has been deep, and it continues to recycle itself. And into this context, into this world, stepped the sisters. And they put down roots, and they stayed. They set up the old convent, and historian Pat Jacobs writes that once here, the sisters did become a strategic tool of both church and state. And the missions and the sisters were involved and used within that system. But when I was reflecting for this talk, I kept wondering, what was the motivation for the sisters themselves in coming here? In the heart of each of the women, why did they leave life as they knew it and come to this place, which was, it would have been to them such a place of such extreme isolation, and a shocking place and a harsh place? So why did they come? I asked this question the other day to my father-in-law. I asked Kevin what he thought, because I thought he was quite well placed to give his opinion on this. Kevin was educated by the sisters, and his family on both sides had close relationships. And as I mentioned, he's a long-term volunteer of the centre, and so he intimately knows this history. So I asked him, why do you think they came? And he told me that he thought that they came to convert, and also overwhelmingly to care. To care. He said that they wanted to respond to need. Whatever need the community had, they wanted to respond. So they did this through offering education, and so many generations of families in Broome and beyond were educated by the sisters, and they did this through nursing. They nursed the sick, and they responded to any other need that the community told them that they need, and they were very versatile in that way. So they came to care, and Kevin told me how the sisters became, for some people, almost like part of the family. And in his words, he said that over the years they became very attached to the Aboriginal people and their causes, and they helped to nurture the people in the best way they knew how. And so I think what there can be no argument about was the sisters' commitment. Their commitment to the people of the Kimberley. They were committed. And I'm talking long term. They were not seagulls. There was no flying in and flying out for these sisters. They came and they stayed, and they're still here today. So Pat Jacobs wrote that the sisters were unique in the continuity and duration of their relationship with the Dampier Land people. And that relationship developed an extraordinary new layer. And as Helen Mary mentioned, this was in 1993, when they started collecting photographs from their history, their time in the Kimberley, and began cataloguing and archiving them. And they had this wonderful centennial celebration, and as my father-in-law tells the story, there was talk then afterwards about what should happen to these remarkable photos. Should they get sent back down to Perth? Should they go back to Ireland? And as Kevin told me, there were people here Aboriginal people and others that were incredibly closely connected with the sisters, with the history, and they said, well, wait, no. These photos need to stay here. This is our history, and we who are part of this history would rather work with the sisters to keep and hold this history. And so that's why the exhibition is here today. So together with the local community, the sisters established the exhibition, and it was brought to life and made into this perennial, ongoing, everlasting and very accessible repository of memory. And the people started to come. From all corners of the globe, they started to come. And if they were visitors, they came to learn, and some of them, shout out to the volunteers, stayed on as valued volunteers. And if there were people whose family was part of the history, they came to remember and to share the history with the younger generations and with others. And so, to walk the rooms of the old convent and to walk through the relationship exhibition really is to walk through time and space. And that day when I walked through the exhibition, I realised what the air was shimmering with. And it was alive with memory. The bad and the good, the memories of a relationship. And it's a relationship that lives on today. On behalf of the Shire of Broome and on a deep personal level, it is my privilege to be with you tonight in celebration of the 2020 season of this most extraordinary of exhibitions, the Sisters of St John of God Relationships exhibition. Thank you.